It's March 3rd, and that means it's Bottled in Bond Day. But do you know what Bottled in Bond means? Welcome to this episode of Wistery, where I explore the rich and colorful heritage of your favorite beverage. I'm your Professor Bourbon Barry, and do I have a story for you? By the late 19th century, the American whiskey industry was in chaos. With no federal regulations, many distillers and rectifiers, producers who blended whiskey with neutral spirits and additives, were selling adulterated products. Some used harmless flavoring agents, but others introduced dangerous chemicals like iodine, tobacco juice, and even formaldehyde to mimic the appearance and taste of aged whiskey. Consumers had no way of knowing what was in their bottle, and legitimate distillers were struggling to compete with these unscrupulous practices. During the 1880s, a growing movement of traditional whiskey distillers, led by Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr., began pushing for reform. Taylor, a staunch advocate of straight bourbon, saw rectifiers as a threat not only to consumers but also to the integrity of the whiskey industry. He argued that the government needed to intervene and create a legal standard for real whiskey. Taylor found an ally in John G. Carlisle, a Kentucky senator who later became Secretary of the Treasury under President Grover Cleveland. Carlisle recognized the government's financial stake in the issue. Since whiskey was heavily taxed, unregulated rectifiers were evading tax collection, costing the federal government substantial revenue. However, not everyone supported regulation. The Distillers and Cattle Feeders Trust, a powerful monopoly based in Peoria, Illinois, controlled much of the rectified whiskey market and had significant political influence. Led by Joseph Greenhut, one of the wealthiest figures in the liquor industry, the trust lobbied aggressively against any law that would favor straight whiskey over rectified whiskey. Greenhut and his allies, including Senator Shelby Cullom of Illinois, argued that blending whiskey was a legitimate business practice, that regulation would unfairly benefit Kentucky's traditional distillers. By the early 1890s, public awareness of whiskey fraud was growing. In 1893, the U.S. was hit with a major economic depression known as the Panic of 1893, and tax revenue became a priority for the federal government. With the support of Green B. Raum, the U.S. Commissioner of Internal Revenue, whiskey reform gained traction. In 1894, President Grover Cleveland appointed John G. Carlisle as Secretary of the Treasury, putting one of the strongest advocates for whiskey regulation in a position of power. With Carlisle's leadership, the push for stricter whiskey standards intensified. By 1896, the issue had become unavoidable. A coalition of Kentucky and Tennessee distillers, including George Garvin Brown, founder of Brown-Forman, and James E. Pepper, joined Taylor in lobbying Congress for legislation that would establish federal standards for straight whiskey. The 1896 presidential election proved pivotal. William McKinley, a Republican, defeated William Jennings Bryan and took office in March 1897. Although McKinley's administration was generally business-friendly, whiskey reform had already gained strong bipartisan support. The outgoing Cleveland administration, with John G. Carlisle's backing, had helped push the legislation through Congress. On March 3, 1897, President Grover Cleveland signed the Bottled in Bond Act into law, establishing the first federal quality standard for American whiskey. The law mandated that any whiskey labeled as bottled in bond must be produced in a single distillation season at one distillery, aged for at least 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse, and bottled at exactly 100 proof. The label was also required to display the distillery's name and location, ensuring transparency for consumers. The act was one of the earliest federal consumer protection laws and played a key role in shaping future food and beverage regulations, including the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Although rectifiers continued to operate, they could no longer mislead consumers by labeling their products as straight whiskey. The law helped restore trust in American whiskey and preserve the craft of traditional distillers. Cleveland's presidency ended the following day, but the legacy of his signing the Bottled in Bond Act would continue. The law proved to be a lasting victory for consumer protection and the whiskey industry. In 1901, during William McKinley's second term, he was assassinated. leading to the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, known for his progressive policies, would later expand federal food and beverage regulations, culminating in the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. More than a century later, the Bottled in Bond label remains a mark of quality, a lasting legacy to those who fought for transparency and integrity in American whiskey. I'm your Professor Bourbon Barry. Thanks for watching.